All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 28 of the Making Noise podcast. My name is Adam Kanan, and I am your host. This episode today features musicologist Stephen Trygar. Stephen is the first musicologist to be featured on the podcast, which is incredibly exciting. I met Stephen after he reached out to me to be on his podcast, the Composer Chronicles. After having the opportunity to speak with him there, which was a fantastic and fun conversation. He is a really great host. I hope you all get the chance to go check out that episode and also follow his podcast. We had such a great dynamic together. I really enjoyed talking with him, and not only that, after we finished the call, we kept talking for maybe another hour and a half, I think. It wasn't even for the podcast. We were just chatting, and I enjoyed the conversation so much, and we talked a lot about musicology that I thought it would be really interesting to have him on the podcast. So Stephen and I talked quite a bit about the career and expectations of a musicologist while you're in college, and how that didn't work well for him, and he wanted to find his own path. We talk about biographies and what is what he considers to be a good biography. We talk a lot about Tchaikovsky, the autobiography by his brother, and Tchaikovsky speaks like 5 languages apparently. I didn't know that. We have this really fascinating conversation about bread, and also the origins of phrases like breadwinner or breaking bread. And that was really fascinating, honestly. We talk about all kinds of other interesting things too, like the issues of censorship, particularly in the field of classical music, for example, especially when the thing at hand that is being considered for censorship is controversial. We also talk about opera and how using different languages for an opera that was written in a specific language. Both Stephen and I agree that we are not fans of that. Yeah, this was a really fun conversation. I'm really excited to have Stephen on here, and I hope you all get a chance to check out the episode and follow his podcast. I believe that's everything. So thank you all so much for listening and following the podcast. Please like, subscribe, follow on the platform that you use, and let's go make some noise. My name is Adam Kanan, and I am a collaborative composer. Join me in the search for a career in classical music. This is the Making Noise podcast. Yeah, Mr. Is it Trygar or is it Traeger? What is
Trygar?
Trygar.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's said exactly how it looks.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times that people have like botched up my name. It literally is pronounced how it looks.
Yeah.
Trygar, which I don't know the origin of that name. I've been told that it's Polish, but it doesn't sound like any Polish name I've ever heard. But
yeah, there's no ski in there. There's no like zh or whatever, or like
yeah. Which is just funny because my mother's maiden name is Zakreski, which is 100% Polish. It sounds Polish, and we know that they were Polish. Every time I try to go and do any personal research on the last name Trygar, it always says that it's Polish, and for some reason I don't believe them. I just don't believe them. And my dad was never as invested into his like family heritage as much as my mom was. And my mom, when I was a kid, my mom would go and she would go to the public library and she would research like the records in the Scranton public library to find her grandparents, the entrance into the city, and like them registering with the city for certain things and postal addresses and all that. And she was so super invested into it. But the most I know about my dad's side of the family was that my great grandfather is the last one of his family to be 100% Native American. And then I think that my dad said that we have some Welsh and some Polish on that side, which I don't know. I digress.
That's kind of interesting to hear though, because like I imagine the Welsh were as well. I don't know European history very well outside of when it's connected to music. But Welsh, well, the Irish, weren't the Irish considered like the like native people of the United Kingdom, or like
in a way, I guess. Yeah, there were definitely when the UK was broken down much differently than it looks today. I mean, Ireland was much more spread out. I mean, they were their Irish culture was based on tribes, and I don't know if tribes is the right word, but there were groups. There were more of like, this is a very small group of people, a family, and the family was in charge of one specific area. Kind of like a lordship, but much more subdued. And then the English were kind of in the similar boat, but I think it was a little bit more melded together much longer ago, more than it is now, where it's distinctly you're English and you're distinctly Irish.
Right.
So I think that it sounds like what from your statement. I think Irish would be probably a whole lot more prominent back in the like early, just after like the first few centuries. Certainly would be more prominent there, but yeah, anyway.
It's interesting to think about. I mean, and like you said, your great-grandfather was 100% Native American.
My dad's side, yeah.
What do we know? What tribe he was a part of?
The Lenape.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The high school right next door to where I went to high school was Lenape Valley Regional.
Oh, nice.
This is in northern New Jersey, so
yeah, which would make sense because that's the Lenape tribes were within the northeastern and northeastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey kind of areas. So yeah, that's it's funny.
Yeah, it's a cool kind of history. I mean, there's a village, or like it's called Waterloo Village.
Okay.
I think it's in Hackettstown, New Jersey, which is like part of the westernmost county of Northwest New Jersey. So
yeah,
right before you cross over the Delaware Water Gap to get into Easton, Pennsylvania, is it's called Warren County. And anyways, Waterloo Village is like an old Revolutionary time, like, what do you call it? Like reenactment. And they have like a whole section of things of the Lenape tribe, like I don't know, like a whole section of like their whole community and stuff like that, and things that they would have used 200 plus years ago and stuff, and it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Have you ever gone to Bushkill Falls?
Yes, but like a long time ago.
Have you ever been into the Native American Museum there?
Oh man, I don't remember entirely. That's a good question.
That was like my dad, because I think my dad is very proud of the fact that he has Native American in him, and so every time that we would go to Bushkill Falls, he always made it a point to go into the Native American Museum. And as a kid, there was, I can't remember what kind of, I don't know what tribe was being featured, but inside the building there's a large room where in that large room is a hut, a recreation of a hut of one of these tribes. And you would go in and it would be like living with the Native Americans for a little bit. And there was a mannequin dressed up as a member of this tribe, and every time you would go in, it would just be like in the dark corner, and you just like I just remember being afraid to go into this little hut because you go in and all of a sudden there would be this weird mannequin sitting in the dark corner. Um, but the older I grew, the more times that I went in it, I expected it to be there, and the more I appreciated the museum. It's a fascinating history, and I wish that I knew more. My great grandfather doesn't. I mean, we don't really associate that closely with my dad's side of the family, and but he doesn't tend to really talk a whole lot about it. I don't know if it's because he feels like I'm one of the last members and we're dying out and I kind of want to let that be or whatever. But either way.
Now that I think about it, I feel like Trygar could almost be a Native American name.
I wonder if it is. Although, actually, I don't know. That's my dad's mother's father is that side. So I don't know. I don't know if that is where the Native American would come in. But yeah, again, I don't know, because the grandfather who gave us that name is no longer alive, so I am not able to ask him what he knows about it.
Yeah, and I'm basing that assumption off of nothing. Like I'm just like finding no association. It's just
it's totally valid, because it's like, Trygar, what could that possibly be? And then you're like given the hint of like, oh, it could be that, and you're like, yeah, it could be that.
Yeah.
And then you're like, but it could be this, and then you're like, yeah, it could be that too. It's just like I really don't know. I wish that I did, but I'm just gonna have to go with the fact that the internet keeps telling me it's Polish.
Yeah. Defer to the internet, man. Like that's like you see it and it's like, well, there it is. There's the answer. I don't need to to try go past that.
Yeah.
So yeah, Steven, this is fun because you are the first musicologist to be on the Making Noise podcast.
Am I? Nice.
Yeah. It's an exciting moment right now.
Making history.
Yeah.
In the making, yeah.
Pun intended.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, we recently had a conversation on your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Composer Chronicles.
Yeah.
Which was an exceptional conversation. I enjoyed it so much. You are an amazing host.
Thank you.
And ask some pointed questions. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the backgrounds for, well, actually, yeah, I definitely want to talk about the podcast, but like, can we talk a little bit about what led you to the podcast as a musicologist, as you know, because you went to Temple University, that's where you got your master's, right?
Yeah, that's where I got my master's, right? Yeah. So I guess what really started me going down this path, when I was graduating from my undergrad, I had completely already known that going into music education was something that was not for me. I went into going into college thinking that music education was the only way I could ever be a professional musician in any way, just because every band director in the area, actually more so the opposite way around, every professional musician in the area was some kind of director at some kind of school. So I had this idea that, if I want to be a successful musician, then I have to be a teacher. And so I went into college, got my first assistant band director position as a sophomore in college, because I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And the school district was like, we don't care if you have a degree yet, we're just going to hire you. And so I worked that year and absolutely despised it. And it was because I was so into the music and my students weren't. And I was just kind of like, why can't you just appreciate the things that I appreciate like I appreciate it? And it was frustrating for me. And besides the politics of public education, and specifically in secondary schools and lower, and so jump ahead, I was getting to the point where I was getting ready to graduate, and I had decided that um, I had to change my major. If I was going to stay in education, then I would have to stay for an extra year and a half, putting me in school for 5.5 years in undergrad. Or I could change my major that moment and go to performance, graduate on time, and essentially begin pursuing my career as a musicologist, because that by that point I had known that music history was the thing that I wanted to do. And so I changed to trumpet performance to be able to pursue music history like I wanted. And I took a year off, worked for the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. I just built up my resume, and then I applied to Temple, got to Temple, and long way around to get to the more specific answer to the question that you asked. When I was going through Temple, I was constantly told, oh, when you have your own classroom, this is what you need to do. And in my head, I kept saying, I left education for a reason. I know that going into higher education, teaching undergrad students is going to be a bit different, but I'm I don't always want to be a teacher. I've never really I do I do consider myself a teacher in some ways, but not in a classroom setting. And so when I eventually graduated from Temple, I was looking for something that was going to allow me to continue pursuing musicology, that wasn't going to bind me into the expectations of what all musicologists are expected to do. Which, sorry, that sentence doesn't make sense, but I didn't want to go into what I was expected to do as a musicologist.
Could you briefly explain what that would have been?
So, I mean, kind of what I was saying before, when I was sitting in classrooms, they were saying, okay, so you're gonna, when you have your own students, you need to do this. Here's what you need to do so that you can go ahead and publish articles in journals. And here's what you need to do so that you can start publishing your own books. And although do I do write books, I do writing. Writing is one of my most, one thing that I consider myself to be as a writer. But the expectation is, at least in my own experience, is that you graduate as a music historian and then you immediately go into teaching the next generation of music historians, who then continue on to be teachers, and then it's just a continuous cycle of teachers teaching music historians who eventually become teachers, and then and so on and so forth, almost as if music historians are expected to be teachers. That it's the only profession where you'll be stable, which in some respects is true. What I do as a music historian is certainly not stable, but it's something that I love to do. Something that I want to make stable. So I guess that's what I mean by expectations put upon music historians specifically.
Yeah, so essentially it's expected that as a musicologist or music historian, you would go on to teach the next generation of music historians on top of doing research and having work published and everything, right?
Right, because so much of what happens in this field, and a lot of respects, so many research opportunities come about because they are a professor at a university. I had a friend of mine who teaches at Temple as well. And the main reason why he became a professor was because of the opportunities that present themselves research wise when you become a professor. He could only do he could only do his research um, and get funded to do that research because he was a professor. And so the being a professor, they would give him a certain amount of money to go and take a semester off to study in Belgium or whatever to do to eventually come back, write a book, have it published by the university because they were the ones who gave him the time and money to go and do such research.
Right.
So it's it that is kind of how I felt that I was being pushed when I was going to college, specifically at Temple. I know that I do have some professors who always told me you do whatever you want to do, but especially some of the older professors that I had, it was consistently, well, no, as a music historian, the most that we ever expect you to do is to continue on to become a teacher. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's something that it seems to me that it's a field of research that is steadily sort of branching outward beyond the university, beyond the academy.
yeah,
And it makes sense that it's been sort of fostered within that because it requires certain resources.
yeah.
It doesn't necessarily require, but like those resources, like really help.
Oh yeah.
Like your friend you mentioned, right? He gets to go to Belgium and pursue the work that he wants to be studying,
Right.
which could present like a whole new concept or way of thinking about some field of music or study or like culture or whatever.
Yeah. Which I mean, I can totally see why he went down that road, because the moment I graduated from Temple, I felt like I had lost an incredible amount of resources that I had at my disposal while I was there. Just being able to access the library and being able to sit in the library for a solid 20 hours, just skimming through books and being able to pull a book off the shelf, and then to be able to walk down the street to the music building, scan myself into the building and go up to a practice room and then play out certain things that I may have found in my research. And it was being in the academic world and being somebody who where my profession inherently requires research, and to have a university at your disposal kind of perpetuates that idea of, yeah, you should probably become a teacher in this field, because the establishments, the universities, the colleges who would be hiring you also have the resources that you need to continue the research that you so love to do.
Right.
And I often wish that I had, and I do. I have friends who work in universities who allow me access every once in a while, who will take out a book for me. But it's one book is not like being able to go into the library and literally take a whole shelf off of the cases and off the stacks and put it down in front of you and sit there in a whole day and skim through like 20 books. It's and that's where so much more, that's where research becomes so much more what's the word I'm looking for, it you don't become stuck in certain biases when you're doing your research, because you see a span of more work than you would when you only give the chance to read one book. And like the research that I do for example, my podcast, I get limited to the few books that I have on my shelf. I get limited to having to go to Wikipedia sometimes. I mean, Wikipedia is a whole lot better than it used to be. I know people say, don't use Wikipedia because it doesn't have any good, decent information, but you'd be surprised how good Wikipedia has become in the past few years. But there's nothing like being able to sit in a university library where you have so many books, so many varying opinions, so many different approaches to how your research has been done, and to then be able to formulate your own opinion based off of those multiple books, rather than just extract the opinion of one or two people from your personal library, or the one book that your friend is able to get off the bookshelf and secretly hand to you, hoping that you're going to give it back to him so that he can give it back to the library.
Right. Yeah.
So
It's really cool to hear this, actually, like the idea of finding competing perspectives,
yeah,
where you're not, like you said, not being stuck in some sort of bias.
right.
I mean, it makes me think about one of the composers I've loved so much is Jacinto Chelsea, and he's known for having musicians come. He was like I think he was like a prince, or like the last prince of somewhere near Italy or outside of Italy, I don't know, but he would have musicians come to his home and like jam, and he would record them, and then he would sort of make arrangements of those jam sessions and then like flesh it out into a whole piece. And sometimes he had this guy, I can't remember his name, like Tomasino or some Italian name that starts with T. He would have that guy like orchestrate things for him. And then after Chelsea died in like 1988, that guy came forward and was like, oh, by the way, all of Chelsea's music is really mine, so I should be credited for it and not Chelsea. And so, like, as far as I can see, there's been some sort of debate as to whether or not Chelsea really wrote his own music and stuff. That comes to mind when you talk about these competing perspectives of, and not being stuck in your own bias of what is or what isn't.
Yeah. It's tough, especially when it's so important to be able to go. And I think this is a conversation that we had after our recording on my podcast. But we had talked about this idea that of primary sources versus secondary sources, and what we should what to expect when going into those kinds of sources. And yes, primary sources are they are closer. They're closer to the time, and closer to the person that you're or topic that you're trying to study. But even primary sources have their biases, because I think we literally talked about the specific composer, Scriabin. Scriabin thought of himself like a god. And his ex-wife thought of him as scum of the earth. So each of them are going to literally, although one person is the person themselves, they think that they're God. So they're going to have a much more positive opinion about themselves, as opposed to the person who spent so much time with him. And she's going to say that he was the worst person on the face of the planet, and that whatever he's saying is a whole bunch of crap. And so don't believe a single word he says. But these are two primary sources, both varying in opinion. So it's like,
who's right? Who's speaking the truth, right? Like,
right. So that's another problem when researching, is that yes, you can go to the primary sources, but how accurate are the primary sources? Sometimes not the primary source, but the source directly after that, like the person who is writing about the primary sources are probably a little bit more close than the primary sources or several sources. So it's like trying to find the middle ground between the primary source and the secondary source, although that next source after the primary is technically still secondary. But you know what I mean.
It's so it's such a like it seems like such a mess to sort of get into.
Oh yeah.
Like, and I don't mean that in an insulting. Yeah, that's good. That's exactly why you do it. Like, and I don't mean that in an insulting way or anything. Like,
No.
just sort of trying to parse through it all. Like, my girlfriend was telling me she had a really interesting conversation in one of her musicology classes, and it was something about oh God, who was it? Was it Duke Ellington or I can't remember. It was a Black jazz musician from the early 20th century, and they had written a autobiography talking about their experience at a certain period in their life, and then there was a biography written by someone who lived after them.
Okay.
And in the autobiography, they talked. The person, I think it was Duke Ellington, but they talked less about their experience with racism.
Okay.
And then in the biography, like the whole first half set up the tone of like what the social tensions were of the time, the race relations and stuff, and then use that as a catalyst to talk about the biography of the musician.
Right.
And so she was telling me how the discussion that they had in their class was of the nature of the idea of like kind of what you're saying, where it's like the primary source has their perspective on things,
right,
and then the secondary source is viewing it from some other lens in some way.
right.
And so like I don't know how to articulate what I'm trying to get at right here, but it's
No,
like
yeah.
I feel like it's connected to what you're saying.
Yeah,
You know?
because once that one person the next person removed from the autobiography in this case, they are already, besides looking at the subject matter, they are then stepping back and are able to see around the subject matter. They're able to see the other people that lived in their life, sometimes even what the venues have to say. Look, my thesis in grad school was looking at a ton of program booklets from U.S. orchestras all around the U.S. Even just looking at those, because the program booklets, they're not going to lie to you unless there was a cancellation of some sort. A program booklet has no reason to lie to you about what's being performed on a concert. So like, for example, a composer says, it was mid-July and it was really hot and I couldn't get this piece performed because it was too hot for the violins to play. And then you look at you try to find when this piece was supposed to be performed, and you look at the booklet and you're like, no, it wasn't July, it was May, so it shouldn't be that bad. So there was some other thing in the composer's mind that said, oh, there's reasons beyond my control that this piece didn't work out. It's probably didn't work out because either you didn't compose it the proper way, or you were a terrible orchestrator, or your engraving was bad, or whatever. But you, the composer, don't want to say that about yourself, especially if you're writing an autobiography where you're trying to make yourself look the best you can. So I get it. So whichever musician, if it Duke Ellington, or I mean, I can see Duke Ellington wanting to do that, but he's not going to want to talk about that because he wants to see himself portrayed in the way that he saw himself, or the way he wanted people to see himself.
Right.
So then that automatically creates this biasy on himself. It's automatically going to create not difficulty, but it's going to create something else. It's going to create a problem for the next person trying to do research or reading this, more specifically doing research, because now you, as the one doing the research, are having to, and it's always so important to do this, you always have to question whether or not the source is looking at this in an objective or subjective way.
Right.
So it's it's a big thing to consider when doing this kind of research, and it's important to do, and it's always important to question everything.
It's like so crazy for me to think about this sort of stuff, like biographies or autobiographies, especially when the person, if the biography is being written while the person is still alive or whatever. It's like, I can't fucking remember what I did yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, like, or like if I'm gonna write a memoir about my life or whatever, and
Yeah.
I don't know, I can't remember exactly like what happened when I was 15 years old and like
Right.
I was skateboarding and then the cops showed up or something, and like, I don't,
Right.
I can't, I could like, I don't know, it kind of amazes me to see that stuff, and then at the same time I wonder, like, am I just really, do I have a shitty memory, or are people just bullshitting their way through biographies?
Yeah. Not to discredit autobiographies, because autobiographies are a wonderful insight into a person's mind.
Sure.
Because then you do know that composer or musician or whoever had that opinion about themselves. You know then at that point that the composer feels this way, and in certain cases they're right. I mean, especially around the time that the autobiography was being written. I mean, I remember reading a certain, I don't know if it was, I don't think it was an autobiography, but it was definitely an account written by Sibelius. And Sibelius had this opinion about one of his pieces of work that was several years in the future, but at the time that he had written something, there was another source that said something completely different. So you have the person talking about it, but people's opinions change. But at least you know that they had two different opinions about the work. And so even then, like as a researcher, you can't say, oh, well, Sibelius said that his Fifth Symphony was the best thing that he ever wrote, because then by the end of his life, I mean, and this is totally not what Sibelius ever said, but by the end of Sibelius's life, he could have been like, no, the Fifth Symphony was total crap, and then he died thinking that way.
Oh God, I hope not. I love that symphony.
No, that's why I said that don't say that. I did say that about Sibelius.
Oh no, I'm not offended.
Rewrote that many times.
Yeah.
Sibelius' Fifth Symphony was one that he loved dearly enough to continue to rewrite it over and over again because he saw so much potential in it. So I was just using Sibelius as an example.
No, you're fine.
But yeah, so
here's a question, and we'll definitely get back on track to the original line of questioning of your trajectory with your career. But what's a biography that you've read that feels, or you have good reason to recognize that it's incredibly accurate? Composer or otherwise too, like it could be like a movie star or like a mathematician,
Honestly, I think one of the best biographies that I had ever read was Tchaikovsky's brother Modest wrote a biography about his brother several years after he passed away. I think one of the reasons why the autobiography was Life and Letters, because Tchaikovsky is notorious for having kept all of his correspondences, for the most part. He wrote letters literally. He would write letters 5 times a day to the same person. He wrote so many letters that there's literally a website that I have worked for in the past that is specifically dedicated to translating all of his letters from the multiple languages that he wrote them in. And I think that's one thing that really helps, that helped his brother out when he was writing this biography. But another reason why the biography really works well is because his brother started writing it while his brother was still alive. When and Piotr was still alive, Modest was there, and he recognized that his brother was gaining success around the world, and so he started taking notice in certain things, and started jotting things down, and was there when his brother died. So that is one of the best biographies that I've ever read, and enough where I tried to find as early of an edition as I possibly could. If I could stand up and go grab it, I would right now. But it's like it's old enough where if I feel like if I were to pick it up, it would fall apart. Because and it it was very obvious that Modest Tchaikovsky loved his brother dearly, because he and the reason, another reason why I feel like it's an incredible biography is because he states multiple times that he doesn't know if this event was true or not. He states this event happened, this is what I remember my brother saying happened, this is what I remember other people saying about this event. So this, he basically warns you throughout the biography to take it with a grain of salt, which is another great reason, another great thing to do in a biography, because he knows, I mean, despite being his brother, he knows that his brother was a bit of a dramatic person, and that he would have fights with people just off of feeling off one day. There were many times where Modest would write that Tchaikovsky would have an argument with somebody just because he felt attacked in some kind of way, and then the other person would say, I didn't mean it that way, but in Tchaikovsky's mind it was all this. It was the biggest deal ever, and Modest would tell you, like, I have spoken to the other party in this argument, and this is how I think that the conversation actually went. Not to discredit my brother, I will tell you what my brother said happened, but I will also tell you to not think of it so personally.
This is incredibly fascinating to hear about. I mean, because it's like, it makes me think about cognitive behavioral therapy, and how in cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea is for you to be able to recognize and manage your emotions and not trust everything you're feeling as to be reality. Right. And so it's like Modest, is that his name, Modest?
Yeah, his brother's Modest. Yeah.
He it's almost like he's the therapist in this situation, and saying, like, look, there's this perspective, but there's also this one too.
Yeah.
Understand that there's some truth in the middle somewhere, or the truth is somewhere in the middle in a way.
Yeah.
It's incredibly fascinating. And I think that is such a great example of what a good biography would be.
And I think what also helped Modest in this case was that he also worked artistically with his brother. I mean, several times Tchaikovsky would ask Modest to write the libretto of something for him. So they worked together. So he knew how his brother worked artistically. He didn't know him just personally, he knew him professionally. So he was able to then parse out certain things, thinking like, okay, so I know how he thought when I did this way, when I wrote a particular paragraph in this way. So when Tchaikovsky would complain about another librettist doing something a specific way, I know that what Tchaikovsky is saying is not all that accurate, because I know that way he works. So that wasn't another reason why I love that biography, because not only did he know him personally, he knew him professionally. So
that's so fascinating. So what's the biography called again?
I think it's called just Life and Letters. Either the Life and Letters of Fyodor Ilyich Tchaikovsky, or just simply Life and Letters.
I'm gonna link to it in the description in the show notes, and
Yeah.
I might even throw up a quick little image of the
Yeah.
title, the cover while you're talking about it, so people can see it.
Yeah, I mean, there's only one biography of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky that was written by Modest, so it's easily can be looked up. So
right.
But yeah, it's my favorite biography of any composer, musician that I've ever read, just because of how well thought out it was. How it's one that every time I do research on Tchaikovsky, I go to first, because I know that his brother was somebody who was like, yes, this is the event that happened, but here's what I also know about it. So
it's fascinating listening to you talk about all this. I mean, because like it's so evident, and you can hear it clearly how much you enjoy it, and and that you are a musicologist, you know, like whether or not it's by, as you were mentioning earlier, following the traditional route of being a musicologist. I mean, that kind of doesn't matter. And so at what point then were you like, okay, well, you knew you didn't want to take the traditional route, and then at some point you started your podcast and stuff. Well, you have a few podcasts actually, right?
I have two podcasts. Yes, I have two podcasts. One is the Composer Chronicles, as we've mentioned, and I think by the time this episode either goes up, you'll have already been on it. I'm not sure when your schedule is, but yes, you've been on it. And the other one is a podcast that I do with my fiance called Cultured But Not Really, where that podcast started because both of us feel like we are incredibly cultured about specific things. Myself being more of the classical culture and history and classical art and literature and all those kinds of things, and then he is like modern culture all the way, like anime and Drag Race and all these very prominently modern kind of cultural things. So when he approached me saying he wanted to do a podcast with me, that was the thing that we both kind of focused on, the fact that the both of us feel that we're incredibly cultured, but we're not really cultured in the way that the other person is. So that's when I came up with that title of Cultured But Not Really, because both of us are cultured, but we're not really.
Right.
So that one is a podcast that we just both love, just doing it for fun. It's just a chance for us every 2 weeks that we get to just sit down and just bring a topic that we think was interesting to the table. He has talked about anime, and I've talked about things like New Year's resolutions, or bread, or and I try desperately to not talk about musical topics, because I know that I always talk about musical topics. So if I can talk about something else, then I will. But I have done a Tchaikovsky episode. I have done an opera episode. And then he's done other things like talking about Roberta Williams, the video game developer, or anime, like I said, anime, the SCP Foundation, and all those things. So that's my second podcast, and it's a lot of fun.
I love the title. It's such a good title.
Thank you.
It's incredibly playful and but also like direct, and like even like the title already gives me an idea of what it might be about.
Yeah.
You know, or not that what it might be about, but at least what you two are sort of presenting in a way. There's a podcast I listen to that has a similar title. It's like these two journalists who talk about like what's happening in the news and whatnot, and like other things and stuff, but they call it, the podcast is called Useful Idiots.
You so idiots.
Yeah, which I love that title too. It's just
That's
so
a good title.
yeah. That's pretty cool though. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a
We're
good
both pretty,
dichotomy, like
yeah.
the old world and the new world, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, because I mean that was the thing that we thought of. Like, so much of history has influenced our current culture, and we approach every episode with we always talk about like the history of this particular topic, whether it be modern or long in the past. Uh, and then we always, for the most part, we always then talk about how we perceive this bit of culture to fit into daily life. Like when he talked about Roberta Williams, he talked about how it impacted his childhood, and how her work has helped to develop future games. Or when I talked about bread, I talked about how the creation of like where bread came from and how important bread is not only as a food part of our food, but how it even affected language specific, like the use of the word breadwinner or bringing home the bread, or it just things like that. And then that's how we approach every single episode: is what is this thing, and then how has it impacted our culture currently.
Yeah, and also the symbolism in Christianity with the body of Christ.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty big one. It's kind of interesting to think about that, actually. I haven't thought about the way in which but food in general, like the sort of ways that food represents some sort of thing outside of itself, like bigger than what it is.
Right. Well, bread, but after bread became a thing where people were like, this is a cheap thing that we can make out of literally everything around us, because some of the earliest breads were made out of just like ground up fern leaves and just anything that they could grind up into some fine flour. But shortly after that, bread became a symbol of status, and if you were a lord in your specific territory that made a lot of bread, then you showed that you, one, have a lot of workers to be able to make bread, and two, that you had a lot of land to be able to produce such bread. And then that's how, and then because of that, it developed into the way we talk about what bread means. Like breadwinner is somebody who brings in the money. And even the old word for the old English word for Lord stems from the word for bread as well. So it's an incredibly fascinating topic that you would never think about, which is why when I talked about it, I was like, yeah, we're going to talk about bread, but bread's important.
It's so amazing, man. I mean, like, I love that right there, that whole idea of yeah, like, okay, we're talking about bread, but it's actually like incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
And like the idea of a breadwinner, and that's, so the etymology of it stems from essentially having enough wealth to like have enough people to make it, have the lands to provide the ingredients. And is that also like breaking bread?
I was just literally thinking, breaking bread, you're sharing your wealth,
right?
Sharing your hard-earned work with each other. That idea, it's bread has so much impact on not just our dining experience. It has a lot to do with our language, with our culture, with how we interact with people. And we don't really know it. We don't really know that it has done that. It's become so far removed from what it has symbolized. And it kind of just, you can go into the store nowadays and you can buy pre-sliced bread, and you don't think twice about where it came from. You just know that you like a certain brand,
Mm-hmm.
and then it sits on your shelf for however long it takes to expire, and or unless you finish it first. But
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bread. I'm a big fan of bread. I will devour that.
I miss bread. I have celiac, and
Right.
I miss a good crusty baguette. I miss bread so much, which is also ironic why I was the one who talked about that topic, because I don't eat bread. I hate gluten-free bread. I have yet to find a gluten-free bread that I enjoy.
Right.
But yeah,
it's hard to substitute stuff like that sometimes. Like,
oh, I know.
I mean, I've had, but it's funny, we're getting to the conversation we had. I think it was after we finished recording your on your podcast,
yeah,
about food. But yeah, I mean, like I've definitely had food where it was like, oh, here's like, I'm trying to think of like some sort of substitute. One thing that I think actually is a good substitute is buffalo cauliflower.
Mm-hmm.
I do like that. But I also love buffalo wings. Like,
Oh, I love them.
I default to a buffalo wing any day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm like, my mind is just completely slipping right now as to substitutes I've had where I'm like, this is not acceptable. I had a weird one, actually. Here's a really weird one. I wouldn't even call it a substitute. I would just say it's a weird combination. I got a burger at this restaurant. This was in Royal Oak, Michigan, right outside of Detroit.
Okay.
And the bun of the burger was like a mac and cheese fried dough ball thing. And I don't know, I was feeling adventurous. I got it and I was just so disappointed. It like fell apart, and like,
yeah, that's something that sounds very appealing, but those things never work the way that they think that it's supposed to work. And especially, like, I don't know what kind of restaurant this was, but especially if they're trying to make it fast, and they've got a room full of people who all want to order the same thing at the same time. So to try to make it fast, it's not going to work the way that it was designed, because you're trying to make it fast and trying to keep individual pieces of macaroni together with just cheese isn't going to always work as well as you think it does.
That's so true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think from that experience, I learned right away, like, I can't order a burger unless it has a real bun. Like that's you know, my expectation is I'm having a burger, it's going to have some sort of bun, whether it's a brioche or like, you know, something fun, sesame seed. I don't know.
Yeah, which is another reason why I hate gluten-free bread, because it's either incredibly dense where you take a bite of that burger and all you taste is the bread, or the bun falls apart on you and then you're literally just holding the meat patty and whatever is on top of it in your fingers rather than any bun. So I just clearly I have opinions about gluten-free bread, which is something that I am limited to. And I'm sorry to my parents, because my parents for most of my life owned a wholesale gluten-free bakery, and their primary thing was bread. And I love them dearly, but all gluten-free bread is trash to me. I have yet to find a one that I actually enjoy. There are ones that I'll buy just because I'm like, this is fine. It is fine. I will stomach this. I will power through, just because you make good toast, but you don't do anything else beyond toast.
Right. Yeah. Well, it makes sense too to hear, like, you know, you have less of a desire for the thing that was the family business because you were so close to it. Yeah. And you know, it's like when we're adolescents and stuff, like, you no longer need the approval of your parents, you need the approval of your peers, which then means that's the age when you start sort of rejecting your parents, you know? And so it's like no longer cool. Like, oh, I'm not going to eat that. No, you know?
Yeah.
So I can totally see a through line where your desire for something like gluten-free bread would be incredibly, you know, and the thing is too, I don't know if I've ever had gluten-free bread. I may have actually actively avoided it because I just want to have straight bread.
I don't blame you.
But but yeah, and it's crazy to hear about, you know, having celiacs and stuff. Like, I think about that. Like, I love bread. I love having garlic. I enjoy coffee. I love dark chocolate, and I have like crazy acid reflux. All of those things cause acid reflux.
Yeah.
And oh my God, like it, like kind of like, you know, what you're saying right now about how frustrating and upsetting it is to not have real bread. Like I kind of see a through line for myself where I'm like, oh shit, one day I won't be able to have dark chocolate.
Yeah. One day it's going to get so bad that I don't even want to deal with it anymore.
Yeah. You're like fuck it, and you just take like semolina and just like throw it back.
Listen, literally, there are things that I will make myself sick for. Like, there is a style of pizza in Scranton. I think we actually talked about this.
Oh yeah.
There's a style of pizza in Scranton that I will go home and eat, and I will make myself sick for, like, because I love it so much. There have been times where I have just been like, I have a whole weekend ahead of me. It's a holiday weekend. I can eat this thing on a Friday night, be sick on Saturday, and still have one more day left to just enjoy myself. And I have done that where I've gone out and I've just like, I bought a baguette or like a focaccia bread and ate a sandwich with it, just to remember what it tastes like. Which is horrible. I know anybody who's listening to this or watching this that knows anything about food allergies. I know I'm destroying myself every time I do that, and I'm making it worse for myself, but I don't. I do it once like every other year. So.
Right. Hey man, you are your own person. You have full agency over what you do for yourself and what you need and what level of like pain and pleasure you're willing to take on, as do all of us. So if people have a problem with that, fuck off.
There was one time, I think it was actually the last time I actually did it was a few months ago, and my fiance's phone number is used every time we go to check out so that we get the rewards points, and he gets an automatic receipt sent to his phone every time we use the phone number. And one time I went to the store and I was incredibly hungry, and it was, again, I think it was like I think it was Thanksgiving around that time, and the store that we shop at has these like pre-made sandwiches that I remember really enjoying. And I had a moment where I was like, I don't have work for the next 5 days. I'm just going to grab a sandwich. And by the time I got home, I had already finished it. And I was like, all right, I'm not going to tell him that I had the sandwich. I'm just going to say that I got sick off of something. And then I opened the door and he was like, did you buy a sandwich? And I was like, I did. I'm sorry. I did. And I'm sorry you're going to have to deal with me for the next few hours as this thing destroys my body. But yes, I did.
This is so great. This sounds like a sitcom or like Seinfeld or something.
Right.
Like I'm picturing your fiance is like sitting at the house or whatever, and then and then all of a sudden his phone goes off and he sees it and he's like, oh, okay. And just waiting for you to walk through the door.
Waiting for me to walk through the door. Lights turned off. I'm walking through the door. Turn on the light. So you did this thing.
Oh, that's fantastic, man. There's something about our intimate relationships that like it I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. Like it just completely creates this like real life sitcom,
Yeah.
and that dynamic is only between you and your partner. You
Yep.
know, like I experience this with my girlfriend all the time, with the stupid shit that I say, and like
Mm-hmm.
I'm constantly like nudging her, you know,
Yeah.
like as if I was like that younger sibling, like poking the older one, like, you know, or
Yeah.
and oh my god, I don't know, there's something, I feel like there's something about that it's part of what really makes you two who you are,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
keeps that dynamic so strong, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotta spice up things every once in a while.
Absolutely.
Gotta
I
shake it up.
yeah, I worry that I do it too much. Like one day she'll just like boom right in the back of my head sort of thing, because
Just yeah.
I'm always a shithead. But you know, like I'll say something and she'll give me like one of these, you know,
Mm-hmm.
just like kind of glaring. But that's just, you know, that's my sarcastic asshole humor.
What can you do?
I watched you ever see Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee with Jerry Seinfeld?
Have not. No.
It's this show on Netflix that he does where it's so just simple and nonsense in a way. He gets like this really nice car, or like a classic car, drives it around with some other comedian. They go out to get coffee, and like that's the show. And it's like they're just
Yeah.
hanging out, like chatting the whole time, whatever.
Yeah.
And one time he was out with was it Bill Maher, or I can't remember who it was, but he Jerry Seinfeld made this joke about them both, like they said, he's like, oh, you're smug and I'm arrogant. And so like something about writing the book of asshole manners,
Oh.
which like that title right there,
Yeah.
it's such a contradiction, you know.
Yep.
Because it's
Mm-hmm.
like you're talking about manners, which is a proper and like appropriate way of interact with people, but then you
Mm-hmm.
preface it with the word asshole.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like that's me.
Asshole manners.
Yeah.
I do have manners. They're just asshole manners.
Right. Yeah.
They're not the manners that you think, but they're my manners.
I love this direction we've come in. It's like this is what's fun about doing podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
You just suddenly end up in this area like, hey, let's talk about musicology, and it's like, oh, I'm an asshole.
Yeah. Yep. Just go with the flow.
So the timer went off before. How you feeling? Do you
I'm good.
do you want
I don't have
to keep
any-
chatting?
Yeah, we can keep going.
Yeah, all right, we'll keep on keeping on.
Keep it on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really fascinating about musicology is when we start talking about things like what the composers were feeling or experiencing at the time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because one of the things that I have trouble with, which is definitely why I'm not a musicologist, is how to extract that. Like how does one come to the point where you're able to kind of put together the I guess you could say like aura around what the composer was experiencing during the time of writing a specific piece.
Right.
You know, I mean, I know there was a point in Beethoven's life where he was trying to gain custody of his nephew, right?
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
and I'm pretty sure that's often discussed in a way where it was a really hard and trying time for him.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a pretty obvious example, I guess. But I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? How does a musicologist come to the point to explain what a composer may have been feeling at a certain point in the, you know, in the process of writing a piece, or even in their life? I mean,
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's when you always let people know that there is this there's a chance that what you're talking about is incorrect. You have to make sure that you preface that in some way. You and you don't have to directly say it. The best way that a musicologist can note that they may be incorrect is by simply listing the source that they found this information. Um, I mean, one, citing your sources prevents you from being like completely going over copyright things and claiming something is your own when it's not. But citing your sources also provides this knowledge to others who may be looking at your work for their own, to let them know that, okay, this person, yes, this person's talking about this, and it's because they found it from this source. So you can't take that as 100% correct. And that's probably one of the best ways. So if we're going to use the Beethoven example, by simply, I don't know if this is Beethoven, something that Beethoven ever did, but if he wrote in one of his journals to say this terrible event happened while trying to take custody of my nephew, the person who's writing whatever research they're doing can basically either quote or paraphrase something that Beethoven has said, but then simply by either with a footnote or by whatever style of citing your sources would be, Chicago style, AMA, or what, or is it AMA? I don't remember. I only use Chicago style. So
is that MLA as well? Is Chicago MLA the same?
Yeah, yes, MLA is the other one, but people who are in the musical world should only ever use Chicago style. It's just the accepted form of the musicologists in this world. And so that's one of the best ways. The other way, which is often looked a little bit less favorable, is by stating that you believe a source to be untrue, unless that is the point of your research. Unless the point of your research is to prove something, then so. If, an example, if a writer were to say, okay, in this same example, if Beethoven had kept a diary and logged on a specific day that a day was tough in keeping custody of his nephew, that Beethoven said this, but I believe that he was overreacting in some way, or I believe that this event also happened, or this event kind of negates that idea, because then you look like the asshole. So the best thing you can do in those scenarios is to either not use it if you're going to try and use it to say that I don't believe this happened, unless that is literally the point of your research. Or to just simply make the statement that you're wanting to make and then just simply cite it, and let people look for it themselves. I mean, there have been many times where not only is citing your sources great for the next person doing the research, because then they have your pool of resources to add on to their own pool of resources, and which doubles your pool at that point. But it then allows the other person to then have the opportunity. And sometimes the research will go to the extreme where they will then not only cite the source, but in one of the indexes or appendices at the end, will then either quote what they were trying to get at or paraphrase it in some way. And then that gives you the chance to read what they were pulling from, and it gives the reader a chance to make their own assumptions without taking the researcher's biases into consideration. I mean, you do have to take the researcher's biases into consideration as well when you do your own, because again, everything that's written down is the person who wrote them down's own thoughts and whatnot, despite whether or not they're trying to state facts. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, totally. Well, it's really it makes me think a lot about like the process you're explaining is incredibly scientific, because
Right.
like when you hear scientists talk about like, you know, like COVID is the most obvious example today, right? But like when they talk about the data, anyone who's a real scientist would start by saying what we know right now is, or what the data is saying right now, or based on the data, this is what we know.
Right.
You know, like I don't think a real scientist would ever say this is this and that's fact, you know?
Yeah.
So like what you're explaining sounds a lot like that to me in regards to when a musicologist is trying to explain how a composer may have been feeling, or what they potentially were thinking and stuff. It makes me, you mentioned one thing about what sort of conclusion a researcher might be coming to with their research, and it makes me kind of wonder, have you experienced any musicological research that the researcher is starting with a conclusion before pursuing the research, which then creates a bias in their results, sort of like that whole saying of like, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And so like, for example, if they look at like, I don't know, Schubert, and they have this assumption like, oh, Schubert was a dickhead, and then so whenever they go to research everything, they're looking to see dickhead tendencies in everything they oh, look here, he's a dick there, oh, look at that letter, he was, you know, like, have you seen that much?
I'm having a hard time thinking of an exact case. I feel like so many of those kinds of writings happen in much smaller forms that I just don't have the access to anymore. A lot of those kinds of a lot of that kind of research is kind of held more specifically to like article writing and in scholarly journals. And again, I just don't have the access to them anymore. So I haven't really come across a whole lot of them in my recent kind of searching. Most of my research nowadays is kept to the books that I can find in stores and what I can find. But I have in the past come across where the researcher has a specific point that they're trying to make, and they only ever look at that, and they only try to find things that prove their point, but completely missing the other things that musician and composer, whoever, also did. I won't name names, but it's not a written thing that I've come across. It was a debate that we had in class the year that I was graduating. We were studying the operas of Richard Strauss, and the person coming to the debate had this idea in his mind that Strauss was a Nazi, simply based off of one thing that Strauss had done. Strauss was a composer for somebody who headed the Hitler Youth, and they came to the debate thinking, oh, this one thing that I found about Richard Strauss, that means that he is a Nazi. So everything that I'm going to do is I'm going to find every case where I believe that Richard Strauss was a Nazi and then bring it to the table, which I had read the same thing that he read, because I saw that he was about to bring this debate to the table in that class. And I knew better than what he was trying to bring. So I found the same article and that he was using to prove his point. And the same article that he was using also was not aiding his point. He found the one thing in the article that provided a fact. He found the fact in the article, but he didn't read the next sentence, because the next sentence was the only reason that he continued to work for this person was because, I can't remember if it was his daughter or his son, I don't remember, but his child had married into a Jewish family. Right. And so the only reason why Strauss continued to work for this leader of the Hitler Youth was so that he was in good graces with that person, and that person wouldn't report him for having a family member that was Jewish. So that was one case where I was like, you need to finish reading the sentence or continue reading on, because you're only finding one thing that you're wanting to find. I mean, and I understand that the person who is coming into this debate was trying to be forward thinking and saying, well, we shouldn't support Richard Strauss because he had this one problematic thing about himself, which is not really a problematic thing to begin with.
It's very nuanced.
Yeah.
Very nuanced situation.
The only reason why he associated with this, with the Nazi party, was because he was trying to save his family. He was trying to protect them in some way. So while I don't know exact articles or books or physical documents that I have read that have done that, I know I've come across them. I can't pinpoint them, but that's at least the one moment where I've been in a conversation where that has happened.
It's an exceptional example, because that's actually sort of in part why I asked that question. It seems to me, from my perspective, that the last couple of years especially, it's become incredibly fashionable to actively discredit and like this person wanted to entirely reject accepting Strauss into the canon of classical music, right? Just because there is even some affiliation, right, without even taking in, like what you're presenting, the nuance of the situation, or it's sort of like that. It is that conversation of separating the artist from the art, sort of thing. And when does that happen? Should that happen? It's that was a great example of that. It was a really good example, especially because I think I recall, because he lived through World War II, right?
Yes.
I think it was in The Rest Is Noise by Alex Ross.
One of my favorite books. I have it literally sitting on my bookshelf.
It's a fucking great book, man.
It's an amazing book.
I think in that book he talks about how when the U.S. came to when they what do you say, like, infiltrated Germany or whatever you call it, like in 1945,
invaded,
when they finally took over and the Nazis were defeated, whatever you say. I feel like it was Strauss he was talking about, when the U.S. soldiers who were coming into his house would there was a bust of like Bach or something, or Bates. I can't remember who it was. It was some composer, and they kept asking him like, "Oh, who's the bust of?" And then Strauss was like, "If one more fucking guy asks me about who this bust is, I'm going to say it's Hitler's father."
Oh my God.
Or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, and I don't remember if it was Strauss, but I feel like it was Strauss.
It sounds like something that Strauss would do.
That's like my kind of humor right there.
yeah that sounds like something Strauss would do.
Yeah, but I do think that there's a great tendency to want to immediately discredit anyone from the past that has some sort of slightly colorful history to their life, you know, and I think that's a concern for me, in the sense that no matter what, we look back on anyone from 10 years ago and we're like, oh, that's kind of a questionable thing right there.
Right.
People, you know, that's part of the human condition, is being what's the word, fallible, right?
Fallible, yeah, that makes sense.
You know, like, and you can look back on any, especially when you look back decades ago or centuries ago, like the morals of that time are not the morals of 2022, like,
right.
You know.
Well, that's another thing, is this you bring up an interesting topic that I've had with several of my other musicological friends, and it was a debate that in the same class that we have had, where we talked about, in one specific case, we said, should we allow Mozart's The Magic Flute to be continued, to be performed on stages, because of one line in the middle of the opera where Monostatos says out loud that Pamina will never love him because white is good and black is bad. And Monostatos is a Moor, so it has a darker complexion. So because he is a darker complexion, then she will never love him because of that. And so the argument was presented, do we allow this opera to be performed? And the conclusion, and the debate continued on with, do we allow people to continue to perform operas like Porgy and Bess and Treemonisha, and the debate stemmed to a recent production that was done in Germany where Porgy and Bess was performed by an all-white cast, and in multiple different things surrounding that particular topic. But the debate ultimately came to the question of, do we allow these types of things to continue to be performed? And as the historian, I always want to be like, yes, it's a part of history. And then the other side of me, the progressive side of me, says, I think we should not perform these things, which then always melds together to my the answer that I give every time is, yes, we should perform these things, because you shouldn't erase history. We have to learn from history. In order to be able to progress, we have to know what people have done, and we have to be able to come to the conclusion that what they did was bad, so that we know what's good. So to erase something that is bad in itself will stunt us from growing, because then we will only continue to go back to make the same mistake, because knowledge is power. So if we know that, and when Mozart wrote that particular moment of the opera, he himself was already reflecting on the problems of the society he was living in. And that's something that we have to also take into consideration, because Mozart himself was a very forward-thinking person. A lot of things that he wrote was in jest of the politics at the time and specific societal ideas. But people think, oh, this was, and that was yet another reason. I mean, the Notte di Figaro is literally a joke. It's a 4-hour long joke at the aristocracy of the time. So we can't take so much of it. Going back to some things that I said before is, I mean, yes, these were also ideas of the past, and sometimes art is designed to show something, and so to get rid of it will also get rid of its purpose as well. To get rid of the Notte di Figaro will defeat the purpose that it was trying to tell us, that aristocracy, the way that this particular aristocracy was being run doesn't work. So you have to be able to keep these kinds of things and able to move forward.
Yeah, so you're mentioning the perspective of the time. You're like what the opera itself was actually commenting on. You know, and like it seems to me like what you're explaining. I don't know much about the Magic Flute, honestly, but it seems to me that are you explaining it in a way where, like, for that time it was progressive in a way?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, I mean, of course, Mozart had his own things that he plugged into the Magic Flute, and with the Freemasons and whatnot, and the promotion of the Freemasons. But with the Magic Flute being an example of racism specifically, do we get rid of the Magic Flute, and do we stop letting it being performed in opera houses across the world because of one line,
right?
That hints towards racism? But the Marriage of Figaro, more specifically, is the whole entire opera is designed to give a message. More beyond what the subject, beyond itself as the story, as the music. The opera was created as a political cartoon, to put it into more modern terms. So sometimes art that seems controversial is created that way to make the point. And then sometimes the art that was made is simply reflecting on something that was happening. And then there are certainly cases where the art is itself problematic. But in all three of those cases, getting rid of them would only make things worse. It would not allow us to see what was a problem. Whatever problem, whether it was purposely addressed or it was just a problem in itself. So
we're talking about censorship here then.
Yeah.
Right. And I am not a fan of censorship, especially with art. Like what you're saying, even when it's problematic or controversial and stuff. Because my one thought is, if let's say, like this example with the Magic Flute, people who are saying, oh, it shouldn't be performed because it has this one line, and we need to protect whoever for that it might be targeting or something. Then what if we were to flip the script, where that person wrote an opera and it offended someone else of the opposite ideological perspective,
right.
and they said that should be censored, right? Like, I don't think they'd be comfortable with that, right? And
Right.
I'm not saying that what was happening in that line is like acceptable or whatever. I'm not making a comment on that. I'm just making a broader comment on the idea of censorship, and the question being that who gets to decide what should be censored.
Right.
I think that's an important question, because if that power, if you're okay with censorship coming from your perspective, if that then gets shifted to the other perspective that you're not so fond of, I don't think you'd be very happy. You know?
Right. Exactly. Unless your art is physically hurting something in the moment. Like if your art, because I know, like there are shows where like cop shows where the murderer will say, "This is my art." Like that's not art, that's murder. Like there are lines, but in these cases where we're looking at something from a historical standpoint that has a potential to be offensive to somebody, that has the potential to portray a certain race or ethnicity or whatever in a certain light, then you absolutely should not erase that, because it will only stunt the growth that we've been trying to make.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the go-to example in these sort of situations is 1984. And like in that book, you know, like in that society, they're constantly rewriting history, where the events that took place the day before are now the next day are rewritten entirely to reflect the opposite thing that happened. You know, it's like on Tuesday, it's like, oh, we bombed China. And then on Wednesday, it's like, oh no, we're great friends with China. It's so cool. You know, like it's like history is suddenly erased. And like you're talking about the knowledge of, you know, being able to grow.
Right.
And there's some disorientation in that, you know, it's like, wait, didn't this thing just happen?
Right.
Like I just saw it, you know?
Right.
And then you have like cognitive dissonance happening that you can't even like the disorientation and cognitive dissonance. It's like it's some serious fuckery of the brain.
Yeah.
It's a challenging conversation. I mean, well, I recently had a composer on, Beata Moon, who she had issues getting the vaccine, like health issues, and so she got one shot and then didn't get the second because of concern of tinnitus. And so as a composer, you know, having ringing in your ear, as a musician, having ringing in your ear constantly is not a good thing. Right. And so she had a feature in an NPR radio show. She was featured on an NPR radio show talking about her experience and how it's affecting her career because of certain vaccine mandates and stuff. And she can't satisfy that. And in the conversation we had, one of the things we wanted to make it clear to everyone was like, or we were really trying to send the message that to try to be a little bit more open-minded and not so like, you know, like sort of what that guy, when you debated him, he saw Strauss worked for the Nazis. That's all he needed to read. And he reacted, he walked away, and then that was the whole thing he got. Right. And so like, you know, you read a headline about on some article, or you read something about a specific person, and if that's all you're going to walk away from, right? That's like the, what is that? Just straw man, right? That's straw manning a position or something. Then you're sort of removing the humanity of that person. Right. You know? And so, yeah, we were calling for that. We were calling for people to be more charitable with how they interpret things, and in these sort of instances, right? Like looking back on films or music or stories and stuff that of today is questionable, but serve an important historical significance. And still, even at that, like, let's not forget the Magic Flute has music in it, right? Like like the melodic lines, the harmonies, the orchestration, the
Right.
like all that is a part of it,
Right.
and we're musicians, so yeah, the social and political commentary and the situation, all that stuff is a part of it. Music is a social act, but we're in it because of what music does for us,
Right.
so like let's not forget that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's so important. I mean, the argument then continued on to, well, um do we rewrite the words? Because the Met Opera in New York does, when they do the Magic Flute at Christmas time, and it's specifically geared towards children. They rewrite the words, um, to fit a more appropriate audience, and they only do that when they do the English version, because of course when they do the German version, most people aren't going to understand it anyway, especially children, unless the child speaks German. Um, but even the argument continued: do we do that as well? Do we rewrite the lyrics? And the answer in my mind is still no, because you're still censoring it.
Mm-hmm.
It's still censored, whether you perform the whether you perform it in its when you get rid of it in its entirety, or you change the bad parts, you're still getting rid of the thing that we should be learning from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. That's a really good point. And I'm glad you mentioned the English version, because like, please humor me here. I'm not like, I don't know a lot of opera. I haven't really been to opera. I didn't know that it was performed outside of the German language.
Yeah, and as far as Mozart operas go, the Magic Flute is certainly the most performed opera in English, because it only really does have that one problematic thing about it, and it's easy for children. Like, if you're trying to get a child into opera, the Magic Flute is absolutely the way to go. It's a fantastical story. It's got witches and villains and heroes and dragons and all those kinds of things. So the Magic Flute becomes a huge gateway into the world of opera, especially for a younger audience. And so I have personally performed the Magic Flute in English. I performed I actually performed multiple parts, because I was they wanted to utilize as few people as they possibly could, so they gave multiple people multiple parts. But I've performed that in English. It's one of the very few operas I've ever performed in English. But I have yet to hear a production of like The Marriage of Figaro in English, or Don Giovanni in English. But yeah, sometimes, I mean, as much as it takes away from experiencing the art as intended, sometimes in performing these things in the English language, in translating them, is certainly important to try and get people interested in it. Like, I know the Philadelphia Opera Philadelphia here performed Prokofiev's "The Love for Three Oranges" in English a year and a half ago. The opera was written in Russian, with an alternative French version as well. Prokofiev wrote the opera in both languages, because he believed that the people of Chicago, during the time that the piece was written, were not going to favorably look upon his opera if it was sung in Russian. So he provided a French version as well. But then later on, an English version was provided, because it was such a popular opera that he wanted to even take it even further, and allow allow English people to people who only spoke English, and to give them that chance to experience it even further. So that's something that tends to happen a lot, especially within opera. Because I don't know too many musical theater pieces that are specifically in other languages. But within opera, they do a lot of English translations, or just vernacular translations of the opera, in order to get more people in the seats.
This is really interesting.
And to sit down and enjoy the performance even more than if they were to go into the hall and only be able to experience the just experience the music and the acting. I had a friend that I took to see Lucia Lammermoor a few years ago, and I told them when we were going in, Lucia, just because they're going to be singing in Italian, and I know you don't speak Italian, and we're going to be sitting in seats because I'm very poor, or at the time I was very poor, so I bought $30 seats, which were both obstructed view and had no view of the super titles. I had bought a seat for myself, thinking I'm the only one going to this. I don't really need to see the super titles. So I had bought the $30 seat, thinking I know this opera well enough to be able to just go to it, experience this particular performance, and walk away from it without worrying about anything. But the person that was sitting next to me had never seen it before. This is the first opera ever. And so going into it, all I had to simply say to him was, think of this as a Romeo and Juliet story. I will only tell you that and allow you to experience it the only way you know how to experience it. And he walked out of the opera saying, if you didn't tell me that this was a kind of Romeo and Juliet story, which Lucia Lammermoor is nowhere near Romeo and Juliet, but if you didn't tell me that, then I probably would not have enjoyed it at all, because I don't speak Italian. So those kinds of moments are important. Like having a translation of an opera that is done and performing an opera in a specific language allows for more growth within your company. I think that doing every single performance you do in English is not that great, because then you also then you go in the opposite direction, where you make the people who are sitting in your audience feel like they, like myself, if I were to go to an that whole entire opera season where everything was in English, and I would probably be like, me as a historian wishes that you would have done it the original way. And I feel like you're just catering to one specific group of people, which I sound like an absolute snob right now at the moment, but I enjoy the performances being done in the original language, because to me that is looking even closer into the world of the composer or whoever is performing. So yeah,
I'm with you, man. I mean, all these languages are so different, and the composers are writing the notes in the range that they're written in to like in concert with the language,
right?
Like, so by shifting it to English, then you're probably missing like certain timbral aspects of what the melody should be, or like the certain punch. I mean, I have no doubt that when they arrange it or when they rewrite it and stuff, well, I don't know. I hope they put that into consideration. If they don't, like,
a good translator will do that. I mean, exactly to your point. If somebody were to perform a Janacek opera in English, it would completely disrupt everything that Janacek had put into it, because Janacek thought about the Czech language. He based every single melodic line or every single musical moment off of the rhythm and how the Czech language is spoken. So in those particular moments where you perform, yes, if you were to perform a Janacek opera, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the Cunning Vixen has been performed in English, but I mean, performing any of his operas, like, it just completely gets rid of everything that he was trying to do, and it disrupts it. Even to the performers, it will disrupt something, because then it doesn't feel as natural, because it wasn't intended to be that way. I because I work in an opera school, I have so even a perfect example. Last season, we were performing Donizetti's La Favorite, and that opera was written in French first, although Donizetti was an Italian composer and 90% of everything that he wrote was in the Italian language. He happened to write this one opera in French. And because he was somebody that wasn't necessarily well versed in the French language, he made himself more susceptible to understanding the French language. And so the opera then transformed from the French language more, because he was doing his best to understand the French language on top of it. And multiple different opera companies around the world will perform this opera in the Italian language, because there is that option. And a lot of people will say, well, it's Donizetti, so you can't perform Donizetti in any other language other than Italian, because that's pretty much everything that he did. And there was one of our resident artists came out to me one day. We were just having a conversation, and they were mentioning that they have done an aria from this opera before for one of their competitions or one of their auditions. And they mentioned that singing it in the French version is so much better. It flows better with how the melodies were created. It just makes more sense for them musically, rather than when they were trying to prepare it for an audition or a competition in the Italian version, because the Italian language doesn't mesh with the French in this specific way that Donizetti wrote the music. So, well, yes, it's important to get audiences in the seats, and for them to be able to take away something by doing an English version or a vernacular version of the opera. It doesn't always bode well for everybody, because the people who are there who are more invested will notice that the musicians aren't performing their best, or the opera isn't being performed its best, because it is disrupted in some way.
It makes so much sense what you're saying. I mean, it kind of connects back to what we're talking about with censorship in a way, because I would imagine that any musicologist or something, if like whoever's writing the program notes or something, if they're talking about this opera that Donizetti had written as an Italian using French, he doesn't know the French tendencies as well. So there's going to be an interesting different way that he uses it, right? Which would make the music, oh, this is kind of fascinating, like when you have someone not of that specific culture using those cultural, whatever you want to call it, like it can be a new sort of way of doing it. Not that it has to be that way, but like the point I'm making is that I can imagine someone being like, this isn't the right way to do it in French. This is how you should do it. And then trying to correct it.
Right.
But he could have been presenting a whole very interesting way of like how the French language could be performed if one were to choose to do that.
Right.
and like I'm a composer, so like I think like this is why I have such an issue with stuff like, oh, we need to change the language that's used in this opera because of the people. Is like when I'm composing, I'm thinking a lot about like how every sound is made. You know, like the last piece I wrote for voice a few years ago, there's a long sustained, the singer at one point sustains the word no for a while, like just the oh for a while. If it was in German, it would be I, like nine, you know, like I don't like the warmth and open sound of an O versus the closed nasal I sound. It would completely, it's if I heard that in that moment for the piece I wrote, I'd be like, no, don't do that. like this is not the character, this is not the mood, this is not the timbre that this section of the piece is needing, you know. And so like hearing that, I'm like you know, but that once again, that's the composer side of me, right? Like it's interesting though. I like going back to Prokofiev and Tchaikovsky. Is there something like do Russian composers speak many languages, or was it just like the time that's like composers, they were traveling the world, so they were speaking a lot, you know, like
this is a topic that I've done a lot of research on. So this also ties into my own personal career as well. Russians who were trying to make themselves more Russians, a lot of Russian history has some they weren't always very proud of their culture. There was a period of time where the Russians were trying to adapt different cultures into their own, and for a long period of time Russia became very French, and so when like a composer like Tchaikovsky was born, he was pretty much forced, not forced, but it was expected that he were to be multilingual, at least besides Russian, to also understand the French language. French was, at the time of Tchaikovsky's life, the universal language, like English is today. At that point, if you wanted to do any kind of business, you did it in French because that was the language that everybody spoke, unless you were in America, because people in America still were pretty much like, we speak English. But for the most of Europe, if you were to do business, you were to do it in the French language. So everybody grew up, including other countries, you grew up speaking your primary language, and then you also spoke French. Tchaikovsky went even further, and he studied German, and then he studied English, and he studied Italian. English was the last one that he went to, but Tchaikovsky, by the end of his life, knew how to speak Russian, French, Italian, German, and English. So he spoke 5 different languages, which makes... Remember when I said that Tchaikovsky website there's a website dedicated to just his letters and the multiple translators that are needed to work on it, because he wrote in all of those languages. Sometimes even in the same letter, he would write in like 3 different languages, just because the other person also spoke in those languages. But even going in later, like Prokofiev and even Stravinsky, it was, if you wanted to be a composer, being in Russia was not the great, like you couldn't do it in Russia. If you wanted to become an international composer, if you wanted to really take your career off the ground, being in Russia was only going to not hinder, it would stagnate your career. You would be one thing all the time. And people like Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, Stravinsky, even Scriabin and Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff was late enough where he went from the Soviet Union to America. But I mean, like Stravinsky found success in Paris with the Ballet Russe. Prokofiev found the same success because of the same people. And then he also found success in America. So then he ended to go and speak that language as well. And we here in America, we tend, at least nowadays, tend to forget that there are other places to do business and other places that that we can take our careers. But nowadays, English is so universal that most people are like, well, I can speak English anywhere and anybody would know what I'm saying. But at that time, if you wanted to do business, you needed to speak the language of the business that you were going to be doing it in. Germans were a little bit more tight. They were kind of within their own world a little bit. But anybody coming from outside into Germany was expected to speak German, which is why somebody like Tchaikovsky also learned how to speak German, because he wanted to be able to go to Germany and have his pieces performed there. Just so how I mentioned how this tied in my own career is when I was going to get my master's degree. I knew that I wanted to study Russian music. The Russians were they still are like my primary focus. But I was running into the problem where the Russian language is also changing, like from Tchaikovsky to Stravinsky, the language had already changed. The Russian language went from this old style to the style that we know today. So I went in learning Russian. I went into my program having started learning the Russian language, and I quickly realized that I was studying the wrong Russian for what I wanted to do. I was studying the Russian of composers today, which would pretty much stop me at Stravinsky and probably even just a little bit earlier. But if I wanted to study composers like Tchaikovsky, like Rimsky-Korsakov, like Balakirev, or Cesar Cui, like any of those, then I'm already out of luck. I started learning the wrong Russian, because they spoke Old Russian, which is not really that far off, but it's far enough off where I felt that I was going to fail my Russian exam the minute that I started taking it. So I ended up switching to French because all Russian composers spoke French as well, because they were expected to. And a lot of times they wrote in French as well, especially people like Stravinsky, like Prokofiev, because their careers started in Paris, and they corresponded with people in French. They most of that's why, like, the Stravinsky's first few ballets are in the French language. I mean, not Petrushka, but like L'Oiseau de Feu, the Firebird, or Le Sacre de Printemps. Like, the Rite of Spring. We've added the English to them, but he wrote them with the French titles because he was in Paris, and that's how they operated. So long way around, they spoke those languages because if they didn't, their careers would have pretty much been stuck to Russia, which at that point was already very limited.
It's interesting to think about this from a business perspective because that's all marketing.
Yeah.
You know, like positioning yourself in a way to make you most marketable.
Yeah. And it's not just music. It was the reason why somebody like Tchaikovsky went and started learning French as a child was because his family was expected to go into to be a civil servant. Tchaikovsky did not start off his career as a composer. He went in and he went to the School of Jurisprudence, and he was a civil servant for several years. By composition standards, Tchaikovsky started late. And so just to make my point, the Tchaikovsky speaking French had nothing to do with just being a musician. It had everything to do with being marketable, with being able to have a conversation with anybody to further whatever he was doing, and make himself and his job better.
Wow, it's so interesting to hear this, man. I feel like just looking at Tchaikovsky, I could hear him speaking all those languages.
I know.
like that iconic photo of him in the black suit or whatever, and it's just his white beard, his white hair. Or I guess painting, not a photo, but
yeah. There are entries in Tchaikovsky's diary that go back and forth between Russian and French. And there's one particular entry in his diary that I find incredibly humorous. He had taken a trip to, I believe it was in Italy, to compose his opera, The Queen of Spades. And he had one of his servants along with him to help him so he could have somebody there to bring him lunch as he was working and everything. And he brought his diary with him, and his entry for one of the nights that he was working on his opera, he confessed something very personal about himself. And in the next sentence after that, because the diary that I have goes back and forth between, it's written in Russian and then it's written in French whenever he wrote the French. So it was written how he would have written it. In the entry, he says, "I'm writing this in French so that whoever was his servant cannot read this and snoop on me." So he knew that his servant didn't speak French, and he was able to write in multiple languages. And he did that frequently. He would write in German in certain parts of his diary so that nobody else but him could ever read it. But it's one of the things that I always find. He spoke so many languages, and I'm like, if only I could learn another one. I mean, I feel like I dabble in several other languages just because I do it for my own research, but to be able to not only understand it, but to fluently speak 5 different languages and understand and have a conversation with it, it just baffles my mind. It's incredible.
It baffles my mind too. I would love to be bilingual, just bilingual. I would love to be bilingual. Like, give me just one more language, I'd be psyched. Like 5.
Yeah.
I don't know if I even know anyone that speaks more than 2 languages.
Yeah. I had a cousin who spoke English, French, and Spanish, but that was the most that I ever knew somebody speaking multiple languages.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense with the Romance languages because there's some overlap in many ways, right. And but I mean the thing with French that I've never learned French, but like the amount of tongue action that happens in the French language,
Yeah.
I don't know if I can handle it. There's like so many like sounds and like
Yeah. It's so funny because our last episode of Cultured But Not Really, my fiance did his episode on Robert and Sonia Delaunay. And most of the episode, he kept looking at me saying, did I pronounce that right? Because he would attempt to say these French things in French. And it's just like, I could see it's hard. It's like the English language, the way we form words is nowhere close to how the French form words. There's missing letters. There's letters that don't make any sounds. Sometimes a word that has an S on the end sounds the exact same way as if it would have without the S at the end. Like if you're trying to make something plural or singular, you just add an S at the end to make it plural, and you still don't pronounce it even though it has the S on it when you read it. So
that's funny, man. That confuses. I mean, it's like we do that too, right? Because we have letters that are silent, like knife. The K is silent, you know.
Yeah.
Oh man, I took Italian in college. I could like comfortably sound out words.
Yeah.
I can't speak the language. Like I don't know. I couldn't sit here and say a full sentence. I could gather words as people say them. I'll be like, oh, they just said good, you know, like, but like I understand that like CH in Italian is the hard K sound. CI is the chi sound, like, you know, like stuff like that. That's what I gather. Which is less than elementary.
Right.
I think we've had such a vast, varied conversation of all kinds of topics and stuff, and we haven't talked very much about what you do.
That's okay. I mean, I feel like I think everything that I've talked about pretty much sums up what I do.
Let's do. Can we have like a brief sort of chat about that, and then we can call it a day?
Yeah. You more specifically referring to Composer Chronicles?
Sort of the umbrella of everything that you do, because you have a whole like media company and stuff that you run.
Yeah.
And if you can tell us a little bit about that, like all of that stuff, honestly, and in whatever way you want to. If you want to be really fleshed out, if you want to be like, I'm tired, dude, look, it's just this, like.
I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. So when, like I said, when I was graduating from my undergrad, when I was graduating from Temple, I didn't want to pursue teaching. Although sometimes I wonder if I should. But I wanted to figure out a way to be able to continue to be a musicologist in my own way. So I didn't really find that opportunity until we had our first lockdown from COVID. And I was sitting at home and I had started writing my first book, and I was like, I should preface it. When I graduated, I had started a blog, and I was just doing a classical music blog, and I felt like it wasn't really going anywhere. I felt like I couldn't really portray what I wanted in a blog. And so then I had started writing my first book, and again, I felt like I just wasn't my intention, what I was trying to get across wasn't working. I am somebody who loves storytelling, and everything that I write, I always want it to be, and because I've talked about opera a lot today. I love dramatics, especially when it comes to writing and the creation of things. Uh, so I was trying to figure out a way that I would be able to blend my love of literature and my love of music history. And I had been told multiple times that I should start a podcast. I loved listening to podcasts, and I was always talking about like what my favorite episode was, um, and I was listening to podcasts like Lore and Myths and Legends and all these storytelling podcasts, and I was like, God, I would love to be able to do something like this. I just don't know how I could do it. But I don't want to really start like another myth or legend podcast because I feel like everybody and their mother has a myths and legends podcast right now. Um, so how do I do that for music? How do I do that for music history? And so I took, it wasn't until the lockdown hit where I started to really sit there, because I had the time to sit there and figure out what can I do? Why isn't my blog working? What can I do to make it better? And how do I start doing the audio versions of this? So um, I sat down and I wrote a script, and I did the one topic that I knew that I would nail, and that was to write a kind of story version of the life of Tchaikovsky during the time of writing his opera Eugene Onegin. And that was my first episode. I wrote that script, I recorded it, and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to promote my career. This is how I'm going to further my career, and this is how I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. Um, and this is what that's what really then started to formulate the the mission that I've always, that I knew was always there, but I needed the Composer Chronicles to begin in order to put it down and be able to express it, which was classic, quote unquote, classical music is not as scary as you think it is. Uh, Music of yesterday has had more of an impact on our current music than you may think. And it wasn't until I was rounding about 14 episodes in where I actually had the first live guest on my show. And I was hesitant to have a guest on my show because I was like, oh, I want to stick with the history. I think if I continue with the history, then I will I'll grow that way. I don't want to become anything too I don't want to become anything more than just a historical musicologist. Um, and the day that I had the interview, everything changed. That was when I realized the mission that I'd always wanted, and which was to not only understand the music of the past, but to also use the music of today to help people understand that. But even more than that, to provide a platform for living composers to share their own stories. Because I feel like so many times that a composer sits down for an interview, it's because they're talking about a specific piece of music that they wrote. It's talking about the time that they they took to write that specific piece, or focusing on one particular aspect of their career. But how does a composer become a composer? Yes, we have all these people in our history that wrote music. We have thousands upon thousands of people who wrote music in over thousands of years. But how, we can't hear it from their lips anymore. We can't hear Beethoven say, the moment that I realized that music was the thing that I wanted to go into was this. So that was really why I continued after that first episode, where the composer I featured was Andrew Gavin. For some reason, one day I was just like, I'm gonna find a composer. I just searched composer into the search bar of Instagram, and I clicked on the first person that came up on that list, and he was the first one. And I reached out and I said, hey, I'm attempting to do something new with my podcast, and I would like you to help me try and figure this out. And since then, he has become a very good friend of mine. I think he's had 2 episodes that he's been on, and he's been on a third. He has composed the music to my Patreon only podcast, and he and I became really good friends because he was the one person that helped me to realize a lot of things. But in the same vein, I feel like every time that I have a guest on my episode, that person becomes the next great friend that I have. And I mean, there are certain cases, and I will not name any names. I have had some terrible episodes, not terrible episodes, and terrible interviews that I've had that I am not happy that they still exist. But the episodes, I mean, not the person. The episode still exists. I wish that the episode would somehow fall into the deep dark pits of the internet and no one would ever see it, but somehow people keep going back to them. And I so to really kind of focus back in, the Composer Chronicles has become more than just the vehicle that provided me with the idea that this is it's been become more than a vehicle for me to continue to pursue music history. It has become a way for me to provide a community to not only the composers I feature, past and present, but to create a community for people who may be looking at composition as a career, or maybe super interested in music but not understand where it comes from, or anything that surrounds music. Because if we can understand what somebody is thinking, then we can better understand the music that we listen to. And I don't just focus on classical, quote unquote, classical composers. I have songwriters. I have video game composers, film composers, composers who do other different forms of media, because the Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Bach, Schubert, Schumann, all those people have had their impact on how we create music for film, how we create music for video games, and how composers who write for the concert stage write their music. And music is one very, very large idea. Yes, there are certain subcategories and genres, but it just, and I hate to tie religion into it, but Adam and where would we? Yes, Adam and Eve were the first people alive, and were the first people created. But everything, there's always one point, and it always stems, and everything everything has been influenced by the thing that came before it. And it's an ever growing tree. There's always the same yes, there is one source, but there everything stems from that one source. So screamo rock music and boss cantata in whatever key, because he wrote in every single key, they're not that far away from each other. They're both music. While we all have our opinions about the music that we like and whatnot, it's still there. And the other side is that a composer who writes for video games doesn't necessarily, they think similarly to somebody who's writing for the concert stage sometimes. And that's important to know, because if you are somebody who is interested in writing for the concert stage or for a film, then you know that there's multiple avenues. You know that you know how somebody thinks, and you're able to apply that to yourself. And I feel like I'm jumping all over the place, but that's how it feels a lot of times, because it feels like this one podcast has so many has so many reasons to continue to go on. It gives living composers the chance to promote themselves. It promotes classical music. I don't like using the word classical music. It gives historical music a chance to be seen in a way that doesn't seem so scary. And it gives people who are looking at music a chance to say, oh, it's not all that different. Yes, this is, I love John Powell's score for How to Train Your Dragon, but it wasn't created so differently than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. There were still those ideas kind of ringing around in each of those composers' heads. So it doesn't make Beethoven's Ninth Symphony that much scarier anymore, because I know that they felt this way about it, or they had this process, or that the composer was, that, like going back to Tchaikovsky, that composer was going through the shittiest time of their life while creating one of the biggest pieces of music that ever came out of their pen. And it's moments like that where there's more to composers than just what they produce. There's a reason they produce it, and every single composer has a reason. It's not just because yes, a composer may say, I wrote this because it was a commission and I just took it for the money. But for pieces like Eugene Onegin, there is a reason. There's a reason that they wrote it. And if you can understand that reason, then you might just appreciate it a whole lot more. And you'll be able to apply that to not, if you are a composer listening to my podcast and you find, because I've had this, I've had composers listen to my podcast and have heard a historical episode and say to me, I didn't know that Shostakovich wrote his 14th symphony while the city of Leningrad was falling around him. It was literally under bombing as the performance was going on. And he wrote that symphony to keep people off the battlefield, to prevent them from dying. And it gives that person, that composer, the understanding that that person's composition was fantastic. It's a composition that I look towards as a source of inspiration, but it was a rough time for them, and I may be going through a rough time, and I may be stuck with trying to figure out what to do with my music, and it's just, it makes that all the more important.
What I love about everything you just said, well, first of all, I want to say is I've experienced your podcast. I've listened to a few episodes. I've recently been on your podcast, and you just sold me on your podcast. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta experience this.
Yeah.
I gotta do something with this lamp. I keep knocking into it. But the other thing I'm hearing is like, you going back, I feel like this whole conversation we're having is based off of the one question that I asked in the beginning, which was the music, being a musicologist question. But yeah. I'm like kind of going back to that, and like I'm hearing you talk about what the podcast is and why you're doing it and all this other stuff, and like it's like the track that you saw for becoming a musicologist wasn't the track that you wanted exactly, but you still wanted to do, like, you still want to teach people it, maybe not in a class setting though. So it's like, yeah, I want to teach, but not in this way. Yeah. And like, and then same thing with publications, like, because you said you've written a book or several books, or you write a blog, and so it's like, I want to be writing stuff, but not in this way, and not under whatever I don't know how it works as a musicologist with contracts or all the other stuff, and but and so like you've like forged this really awesome career as a musicologist out of your own like desires and needs for what you require of your own career. And it's not what you saw in the university. That's not what your career entailed. Right. So that's what I'm kind of hearing, like hearing you say all that. I'm like, it's so cool to see how you've taken this thing that you're like, I don't know, and then you've turned it into something else, which is still musicology. Yeah.
It's still, I always, people are like, well, talking to living composers isn't musicology, and I'm like, yes it is, because these are the people that will make tomorrow's history. That it's, and you have to, it's just like I've said before, in order to understand now, you have to understand history. But at the same time, in order to understand history, you also have to understand what's happening now. It's not a one-way street. It works both ways. And that's while the Composer Chronicles didn't start that way, that is what it is, what it has become, is to prove that time isn't just one direction. It goes both ways, not literal time, like, but just the concept of cultures and events that happen within time happen both ways.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because like, starting from the perspective of now, the question might be something like, how did we get here? Right. Like, you're looking at a situation where it's like, oh shit, my office is flooding. Yeah. Why did that happen? So then you have to sort of travel through the process of like, well, this is cracked here because the kitchen upstairs has too much whatever, I'm not a fucking plumber, I don't know shit. Yeah. But like, so in a way, you're archaeologically digging through the process of why you're in the position you're in now.
Right. Exactly.
It makes total sense, man. It's such a cool, the way you described it, and the the way your podcast laid out, because I have firsthand experience, is it's exactly like the questions you ask, you know, like it's beyond just what is this piece and
Yeah.
why did you write this piece. It's like what led you to this point of like you suddenly decided you wanted to be a composer, or you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, you really kind of tease through that whole lineage.
Yeah.
And it's a really, I very thoroughly enjoyed our conversation on that, and I'm looking
Mhm.
forward to seeing, you know, when it's published and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, man, it's a cool podcast.
Thank you. Yeah. And I know you had mentioned Alexandria Media.
Mhm.
Alexandria Media came out of the Composer Chronicles. I was looking, I knew that I had written books and I had started this podcast, and I knew that I wanted to do more uh, than what I was doing. And Alexandria Media stemmed after I had that interview with Andrew, um, because at that moment I realized that actually even a little bit further back, there was a moment where that episode 14, the episode right before my first composer interview, was the episode that I actually had the first. It was the episode that I had originally composed theme music for the podcast. And there was a moment where I had this feeling of, this can be the Composer Chronicles is already itself a community, but there could be more. There's more. I can grow a community even further. And so having somebody else compose that theme music already then adds a level of community. And then I had somebody draw the illustrations for my books. They're just simple illustrations of the composers that I'm featuring, and then they become part of that community. And then I have somebody who designs the covers of my books, and then they become part of that community. And how do I continue to grow that community while provide, and of course Alexandria Media stemmed out of a very selfish kind of place where I was looking for a place for myself to host everything that I do without just simply saying my name. um, I felt that by putting my name on it was only going to limit me in how I and eventually taking in terms of taking my career even further, because I felt like um yes, the Composer Chronicles by Stephen Trygar with the music written by Daryl Banner, um but how does Daryl fit into this? Why Daryl isn't? I don't want it to seem like Daryl is my employee at this point, because he's his own artist. So how do I do that? How do I make somebody like Daryl or Andrew or Jonathan or Brian? How do I give them the chance to also become part of this community without it being centrally tied to me? Well, yes, I am the head of it and I run everything about it right now. How do I give that person a chance to also grow? How do I allow them to say that they worked on a project without it being just immediately tied to another person? I don't necessarily like the idea of being told, well, I wrote the I drew an illustration for Stephen Trygar. I wrote an illustration that was published in a book by Alexander Media Publishing. I felt that was a better way for me to continue with how I want my career to grow. I want people to feel like they have a community that they can be a part of without it being attached to my specific name. And then that way people can, if once it starts growing to the point where I have multiple podcasts that are associated with Alexandria Media, or I have multiple YouTube channels that are associated with Alexandria Media, then they can say that they're associated with that other channel, podcast, artist, whatever, without saying that it's my name. Mm-hmm. And I had created that initial blog with my name on it and just listing it under my website. And I think that was a good starting point for me to realize, like, this needs something. This needs a place. It needs a community to grow, because we can't always just do things ourselves. Mm-hmm. Well, while we can do our things ourselves, because I run the Composer Chronicles 100% myself. I record and write scripts, and I edit the episodes, and I know that you do all the same thing for your podcast as well. But you can't always do everything by yourself, and eventually you're going to have to ask for help. Eventually you're going to have to go to other people. And that's what I'm doing. I mean, I know my mother says, well, you should just compose your own music for your own things. And in my head, I'm like, yes, I could. But right now, I don't have the resource to do that. And I know I can find other people who can do it better than I can. Yes, I know I learned things really quickly. I learned how to do video editing software in 2 weeks. I learned how to use the entire Adobe suite in a month. And yes, I know I can do that, but I know that there are other people who can, one, help me so I don't drive myself into the ground, and two, there are people who focus on this and can make it better than I can. So Alexandria Media became that place. And while Alexandria Media at the current moment still continues to only host all of my own things, it is a place that I know that I want people to feel like they can come to it and feel like they have a place to grow their culture, and so on.
You're definitely laying such a really great blueprint for anyone else who might be interested in this sort of thing.
Thank you.
I mean, it's cool. It's so cool to hear about the fostering of the community and having this sort of like central area where everyone is sort of connected in some way. And so then that's the camaraderie and
right.
And like, you know, we're all sort of doing this thing independently, but also you know,
right.
Like, I don't know, like together in a way, you know?
Right.
It's a really great sort of like vision, I guess. Not vision, but I don't know what you call that, like philosophy. I mean,
I think both words can work.
I think it's so comforting. That's what it sounds, you know, it's really comforting that, especially through everything, like you mentioned, how the podcast came about during the quarantine. Mm-hmm. You know, when everyone felt disconnected. Yeah. And then now it's turned into this thing where you're like, well, let me start this media company and start it with the idea that we'll all have this thing that's our central connection, and you know, each person moves at their own pace in their own way. Right. It's a great resource you're providing. Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. So I think I've tapped myself out there. It's
a long one.
It's a yeah. I'm so psyched about the way how our conversation started with your career and it's ended with your career, and in the middle we just went through this whole
We talked about bread and everything.
Yeah. Very happy about the bread conversation.
Yeah.
So before we close off here, how can people reach you? What are your socials? What about your book? Is that for sale? Is there the podcast and all that good stuff?
Yeah. So the best place anybody can find everything that I do, including where all my socials are on alexandrianmedia.org. That's the place. I mean, I have my contact on there and everything, but pretty much for me independently, if anybody's interested in looking at what I do independently, all of my socials, I'm pretty sure all of them are just Stephen J. Trygar. I think I have switched him to just Stephen Trygar. I don't think all of them are. So either of those two, and you'll see my weird smiling face with a fedora on my head, sitting outside the Metropolitan Opera. If you're looking for pretty much anything else, everything is pretty much centralized on alexandrianmedia.org. And you can find all the socials to all my podcasts that I do, all the socials to, and where you can actually look to see where you can purchase my books. There are ebook versions and physical versions, and not all of them are sold in the same places. So that's where you can, and unfortunately, just the way that the distributor works is that not all my books are sold in the same place. So if you want to find where you can listen to my podcast and where you can find my books, alexandrianmedia.org is absolutely the best place to find out where you can find everything.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, people head on over to Alexandrian. It's Alexandrian with an N at the end, right?
Yes, Alexandrian. Yes. Questioned myself for a minute.
Yeah, head over to alexandrianmedia.com.
.org.
See, shows where I am right now.
That's all right. It's been a long night.
Stephen, thank you so much, man. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for imparting all of your musicological knowledge and perspective. And I appreciate your time and for being a part of the Making Noise podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.